双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
By William Wood. Preface. 60 years ago today, the guns that thundered round Fort Sumter began the third and greatest modern civil war fought by English-speaking people. This war was quite as full of politics as were the other two, the War of the American Revolution and that of Puritan and Cavalier. But, though the present chronicle never ignores the vital correlations between statesmen and commanders, it is a book of warriors, through and through. I gratefully acknowledge the indispensable assistance of Colonel G. J. Fiebecker, a West Point expert, and of Dr. Alan Johnson, chief editor of the series and professor of American history at Yale. William Wood, late Colonel commanding 8th Royal Rifles, and officer in charge, Canadian Special Mission Overseas, Quebec. April 18, 1921.
Contents.
I. The Clash, 1861.
2.
The Combatants.
3.
The Naval War, 1862.
4.
The River War, 1861. V. Lincoln, War Statesman.
6.
Lee and Jackson, 1862-3.
7.
Grant wins the River War, 1863-8. Gettysburg, 1863.
9.
Farragut and the Navy, 1863-4. X. Grant attacks the front, 1864. 11. Sherman destroys the base, 1864. 12. The End, 1865. Bibliographical note. Captains of the Civil War. Chapter 1. The Clash, 1861. States which claimed a sovereign right to secede from the Union naturally claimed the corresponding right to resume possession of all the land they had ceded to that Union's government for the use of its naval and military posts. So South Carolina, after leading the way to secession on December 20, 1860, at once began to work for the retrocession of the forts defending her famous cotton port of Charleston. These defenses, being of vital consequence to both sides, were soon to attract the strained attention of the whole country. There were 3 minor forts: Castle Pinckney, dozing away, in charge of a solitary sergeant, on an island less than a mile from the city; Fort Moultrie, feebly garrisoned and completely at the mercy of attackers on its landward side; and Fort Johnson, over on James Island. Lastly, there was the world-renowned Fort Sumter, which then stood, unfinished and ungarrisoned, on a little islet beside the main ship channel, at the entrance to the harbor, and facing Fort Moultrie just a mile away. The proper war garrison of all the forts should have been over 1,000 men. The actual garrison, including officers, band, and the Castle Pinckney sergeant, was less than 100. It was, however, loyal to the Union, and its commandant, Major Robert Anderson, though born in the slave-owning state of Kentucky, was determined to fight. The situation, here as elsewhere, was complicated by Floyd, President Buchanan's Secretary of War, soon to be forced out of office on a charge of misapplying public funds. Floyd, as an ardent Southerner, was using the last lax days of the Buchanan government to get the army posts ready for capitulation whenever secession should have become an accomplished fact. He urged on construction, repairs, and armament at Charleston, while refusing to strengthen the garrison, in order, as he said, not to provoke Carolina. Moreover, in November he had replaced old Colonel Gardner, a Northern veteran of 1812, by Anderson the Southerner, in whom he hoped to find a good capitulator. But this time Floyd was wrong. The day after Christmas, Anderson's little garrison at Fort Moultrie slipped over to Fort Sumter under cover of the dark, quietly removed Floyd's workmen, who were mostly Baltimore secessionists, and began to prepare for defense. Next morning Charleston was furious and began to prepare for attack. The South Carolina authorities at once took formal possession of Pinckney and Moultrie, and 3 days later seized the United States arsenal in Charleston itself. 10 days later again, on January 9, 1861. The Star of the West. A merchant vessel coming in with reinforcements and supplies for Anderson was fired on and forced to turn back. Anderson, who had expected a man of war, would not fire in her defense, partly because he still hoped there might yet be peace. While Charleston stood at gaze and Anderson at bay, the ferment of secession was working fast in Florida, where another tiny garrison was all the Union had to hold its own. This garrison, under two loyal young lieutenants, Slemmer and Gilman, occupied Barranca's barracks in Pensacola Bay. Late at night on the 8th of January, the day before the Star of the West was fired on at Charleston, some 20 secessionists came to seize the old Spanish Fort San Carlos, where, up to that time, the powder had been kept. This fort, though lying close beside the barracks, had always been unoccupied, so the secessionists looked forward to an easy capture. But, to their dismay, an unexpected guard challenged them, and, not getting the proper password in reply, dispersed them with the first shots of the Civil War. Commodore Armstrong sat idle at the Pensacola Navy Yard, distracted between the Union and secession. On the 9th, Slemmer received orders from Winfield Scott, General-in-Chief at Washington, to use all means in defense of Union property. Next morning, Slemmer and his 50 faithful men were landed on Santa Rosa Island, just 1 mile across the bay, where the dilapidated old Fort Pickens stood forlorn. 2 days later, the Commodore surrendered the Navy Yard. The stars and stripes were lowered, and everything ashore fell into the enemy's hands. There was no flagstaff at Fort Pickens, but the Union colors were at once hung out over the northwest bastion, in full view of the shore, while the Supply and Wyandotte, the only naval vessels in the bay, and both commanded by loyal men, masthead extra colors and stood clear. 5 days afterwards they had to sail for New York, and Slemmer, whose total garrison had been raised to 80 by the addition of 30 sailors, was left to hold Fort Pickens if he could. He had already been summoned to surrender by Colonel Chase and Captain Farrand, who had left the United States Army and Navy for the service of the South. Chase, like many another Southern officer, was stirred to his inmost depths by his own change of allegiance. "I have come," he said, "to ask of you young officers of the same army in which I have spent the best and happiest years of my life, the surrender of this fort, and fearing that I might not be able to say it as I ought, and also to have it in proper form, I have put it in writing and will read it." He then began to read, but his eyes filled with tears, and, stamping his foot, he said, "I can't read it. Here, Farrand, you read it." Farrand, however, pleading that his eyes were weak, handed the paper to the younger Union officer, saying, "Here, Gilman, you have good eyes. Please read it." Slemmer refused to surrender and held out till reinforced in April, by which time the war had begun in earnest. Fort Pickens was never taken. On the contrary, it supported the bombardment of the Confederate longshore positions the next New Year, 1869, and witnessed the burning and evacuation of Pensacola the following 9th of May. While Charleston and Pensacola were fanning the flames of secession, the wildfire was running round the Gulf, catching well throughout Louisiana, where the governor ordered the state militia to seize every place belonging to the Union, and striking inland till it reached the farthest army posts in Texas. In all Louisiana, the Union government had only 40 men. These occupied the arsenal at Baton Rouge under Major Haskins. Haskins was loyal, but when 500 state militiamen surrounded him, and his old brother officer, the future Confederate General Bragg, persuaded him that the Union was really at an end, to all intents and purposes, and when he found no orders, no support, and not even any guidance from the government at Washington, he surrendered with the honors of war and left by boat for St. Louis in Missouri. There was then in Louisiana another Union officer, but made of sterner stuff. This was Colonel W. T. Sherman, superintendent of the State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy at Alexandria, up the Red River. he was much respected by all the state authorities, and was carefully watching over the two young sons of another future Confederate leader, General Beauregard. William Tecumseh Sherman had retired from the army without seeing any war service, unlike Haskins, who was a one-armed veteran of the Mexican campaign. But Sherman was determined to stand by the Union, come what might. Yet, he was equally determined to wind up the affairs of the State Academy so as to hand them over in perfect order. A few days after the seizure of the arsenal, and before the formal secession of the state, he wrote to the governor, "Sir, as I occupy a quasi-military position under the laws of the state, I deem it proper to acquaint you that I accepted such position when Louisiana was a state of the Union, and when the motto of this seminary was inserted in marble over the main door, by the liberality of the general government of the United States."
De unión esto perpetua.
Recent events foreshadow a great change, and it becomes all men to choose. I beg you to take immediate steps to relieve me as superintendent, the moment the state determines to secede, for on no earthly account will I do any act or think any thought hostile to, or in defiance of, the old government of the United States. Then, to the lasting credit of all concerned, the future political enemies parted as the best of personal friends. Sherman left everything in perfect order, accounted for every cent of the funds, and received the heartiest thanks and best wishes of all the governing officials, who embodied the following sentence in their final resolution of April 1, 1861. They cannot fail to appreciate the manliness of character which has always marked the actions of Colonel Sherman. Long before this, Louisiana had seceded, and Sherman had gone north to Lancaster, Ohio, where he arrived about the time of Lincoln's inauguration. Meanwhile, on the 18th of February, the greatest of all surrenders had taken place in Texas, where 19 army posts were handed over to the state by General Twiggs. San Antonio was swarming with secessionist rangers. Unionist companies were marching up and down. The federal garrison was leaving the town on parole, with the band playing Union airs and Union colors flying. The whole place was at sixes and sevens, and anything might have happened. In the midst of this confusion, the colonel commanding the 2nd Regiment of United States Cavalry arrived from Fort Mason. He was on his way to Washington, where Winfield Scott, the veteran general-in-chief, was anxiously waiting to see him, for this colonel was no ordinary man. He had been Scott's chief of staff in Mexico, where he had twice won promotion for service in the field. He had been a model superintendent at West Point and an exceedingly good officer of engineers before he left them, on promotion, for the cavalry. Very tall and handsome, magnificently fit in body and in mind, genial but of commanding presence, this flower of Southern chivalry was not only every inch a soldier, but a leader born and bred. Though still unknown to public fame, he was the one man to whom the most insightful leaders of both sides turned, and rightly turned, for this was Robert Lee, Lee of Virginia, soon to become one of the very few really great commanders of the world. As Lee came up to the hotel at San Antonio, he was warmly greeted by Mrs. Barrow, the anxious wife of the confidential clerk to Major Vinton, the staunch Union officer in charge of the pay and quartermaster services. "Who are those men?" he asked, pointing to the Rangers, who wore red flannel shoulder straps. "They are McCulloch's," she answered. "General Twiggs surrendered everything to the state this morning, years after, when she and her husband and Vinton had suffered for one side and Lee had suffered for the other." She wrote her recollection of that memorable day in these few, telling words. "I shall never forget his look of astonishment, as, with his lips trembling and his eyes full of tears, he exclaimed, 'Has it come so soon as this?' In a short time I saw him crossing the plaza on his way to headquarters and noticed particularly that he was in citizen's dress. He returned at night and shut himself into his room, which was over mine, and I heard his footsteps through the night, and sometimes the murmur of his voice, as if he was praying. He remained at the hotel a week and in conversations declared that the position he held was a neutral one, 3 other Union witnesses show how Lee agonized over the fateful decision he was being forced to make. Captain R. M. Potter says, "I have seldom seen a more distressed man." He said, "When I get to Virginia, I think the world will have 1 soldier less. I shall resign and go to planting corn." Colonel Albert G. Brackett says, "Lee was filled with sorrow at the condition of affairs, and, in a letter to me, deploring the war in which we were about to engage, made use of these words: 'I fear the liberties of our country will be buried in the tomb of a great nation.'" Colonel Charles Anderson, quoting Lee's final words in Texas, carries us to the point of parting. "I still think my loyalty to Virginia ought to take precedence over that which is due to the federal government, and I shall so report myself in Washington. If Virginia stands by the old Union,
So will I.
But if she secedes, though I do not believe in secession as a constitutional right, nor that there is sufficient cause for revolution, then I will still follow my native state with my sword, and, if need be, with my life. I know you think and feel very differently, but I can't help it. These are my principles, and I must follow them." Lee reached Washington on the 1st of March. Lincoln, delivering his inaugural on the 4th, brought the country 1 step nearer war by showing the neutrals how impossible it was to reconcile his principles as President of the whole United States with those of Jefferson Davis as President of the seceding parts. "The power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government." 3 days later, the Provisional Confederate Congress at Montgomery in Alabama passed an Army Act authorizing the enlistment of 100,000 men for 1-year service. 9 days later again, having adopted a constitution, in the meantime, this Congress passed a Navy Act, authorizing the purchase or construction of 10 little gunboats. In April, the main storm center went whirling back to Charleston, where Sherman's old friend Beauregard commanded the forces that encircled Sumter. Sumter, still unfinished, had been designed for a garrison of 650 combatant men. It now contained exactly 65. It was to have been provisioned for 6 months. The actual supplies could not be made to last beyond 2 weeks. Both sides knew that Anderson's gallant little garrison must be starved out by the 15th. But the excited Carolinians would not wait, because they feared that the arrival of reinforcements might balk them of their easy prey. On the 11th, Beauregard, acting under orders from the Confederate government, sent in a summons to surrender. Anderson refused. At 1:15 the next morning, the summons was repeated, as pilots had meanwhile reported a Federal vessel approaching the harbor. Anderson again refused and again admitted that he would be starved out on the 15th. Thereupon Beauregard's aides declared immediate surrender the only possible alternative to a bombardment and signed a note at 3:20 a.m. giving Anderson formal warning that fire would be opened in an hour. Fort Sumter stood about half a mile inside the harbor mouth, fully exposed to the converging fire of 4 relatively powerful batteries, 3 about a mile away, the 4th nearly twice as far. At the northern side of the harbor mouth stood Fort Moultrie. At the southern stood the batteries on Cummings Point, and almost due west of Sumter stood Fort Johnson. Near Moultrie was a 4-gun floating battery with an iron shield. A mile northwest of Moultrie, farther up the harbor, stood the Mount Pleasant Battery, nearly 2 miles off from Sumter. At 4:30, in the first faint light of a gray morning, a sudden spurt of flame shot out from Fort Johnson. The dull roar of a mortar floated through the misty air, and the big shell, the first shot of the real war, soared up at a steep angle, its course distinctly marked by its burning fuse, and then plunged down on Sumter. It was a capital shot, right on the center of the target, and was followed by an admirable burst. Then all the converging batteries opened full, while the whole population of perfervid Charleston rushed out of doors to throng their beautiful East Battery, a flagstone marine parade 3 miles in from Sumter, of which and of the attacking batteries it had a perfect view. But Sumter remained as silent as the grave. Anderson decided not to return the fire till it was broad daylight. In the meantime, all ranks went to breakfast. which consisted entirely of water and salt pork. Then the gun crews went to action stations and fired back steadily with solid shot. The ironclad battery was an exasperating target, for the shot bounced off it like dried peas. Moultrie seemed more vulnerable, but appearances were deceptive, for it was thoroughly quilted with bales of cotton, which the solid shot simply rammed into an impenetrable mass. Wishing to save his men, in which he was quite successful, Anderson had forbidden the use of the shell guns, which were mounted on the upper works and therefore more exposed. Shell fire would have burst the bales and set the cotton flaming. This was so evident that Sergeant Carmody, unable to stand such futile practice any longer, quietly stole up to the loaded guns and fired them in succession. The aim lacked final correction, and the result was small, except that Moultrie, thinking itself in danger, concentrated all its efforts on silencing these guns. The silencing seemed most effective, for Carmody could not reload alone, and so his first shots were his last. At nightfall, Sumter ceased fire, while the Confederates kept on slowly till daylight. Next morning, the officers' quarters were set on fire by red-hot shot. Immediately, the Confederates redoubled their efforts. Inside Sumter, the fire was creeping towards the magazine, the door of which was shut only just in time. Then the flagstaff was shot down. Anderson ran his colors up again, but the situation was rapidly becoming impossible. Most of the worn-out men were fighting the flames, while a few were firing at long intervals to show they would not yet give in. This excited the generous admiration of the enemy, who cheered the gallantry of Sumter while sneering at the caution of the Union fleet outside. The fact was, however, that this so-called fleet was a mere assemblage of vessels quite unable to fight the Charleston batteries and without the slightest chance of saving Sumter. Having done his best for the honor of the flag, though not a man was killed within the walls, Anderson surrendered in the afternoon. Charleston went wild with joy, but applauded the generosity of Beauregard's chivalrous terms. Next day, Sunday the 14th, Anderson's little garrison saluted the Stars and Stripes with 50 guns, and then, with colors flying, marched down on board a transport to the strains of Yankee Doodle. Strange to say, after being 4 years in Confederate hands, Sumter was recaptured by the Union forces on the anniversary of its surrender. It was often bombarded, though never taken. In the meantime, the fall of Sumter not only fired all Union loyalty, but made Confederates eager for the fray. The very next day, Lincoln called for 75,000 three-month volunteers. 2 days later, Confederate letters of marque were issued to any privateers that would prey on Union shipping. 2 days later, again, Lincoln declared a blockade of every port from South Carolina round to Texas. 8 days afterwards, he extended it to North Carolina and Virginia. But in the meantime, Lincoln had been himself marooned in Washington. On the 19th of April, the day he declared his first blockade, the 6th Massachusetts were attacked by a mob in Baltimore, through which the direct rails ran from north to south. Baltimore was full of secession, and the bloodshed roused its fury. Maryland was a border slave state out of which the District of Columbia was carved. Virginia had just seceded. So when the would-be Confederates of Maryland, led by the mayor of Baltimore, began tearing up rails, burning bridges, and cutting the wires, the Union government found itself enisled in a hostile sea. Its own forces abandoned the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and the Navy Yard at Norfolk. The work of demolition at Harper's Ferry had to be bungled off in haste, owing to shortness of time and lack of means. The demolition of Norfolk was better done, and the ships were sunk at anchor. But many valuable stores fell into enemy hands at both these Virginian outposts of the Federal forces. Through 6 long days of dire suspense, not a ship, not a train, came into Washington. At last, on the 25th, the 7th New York got through, having come south by boat with the 8th Massachusetts, landed at Annapolis, and commandeered a train to run over relayed rails. With them came the news that all the loyal North was up, that the 7th had marched through miles of cheering patriots in New York, and that these two fine regiments were only the vanguard of a host.